I think I was reflecting on this a little bit with some others, that each of these panels seems to require its own conference, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time for all of that. So hopefully you get a chance to connect and continue the conversation during the breaks and lunch, and also in the afternoon. And I did want to make sure that everyone is aware that we have a reception this evening at the Museum of Islamic Art that will include an art program, live music. So please join us, and if you need to get coordinated with the buses, there's more information that can be found by the reception outside. So we started with a regional perspective, and now about water and stability and cooperation and some of the potential challenges that we're facing. But we wanted to bring it down to a more focused discussion and talk about our host country, the state of Qatar. So we have a wonderful panel about Qatar's Odyssey to water security and sustainability. And this panel will be moderated by Dr. Jamie Olsen, who is faculty at the Georgetown University, Qatar. He is an environmental ethicist and works in faculty development and other sustainability issues at the university. Jamie, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raha. I first came to Qatar 12 years ago, and then I had a gap of nearly 10 years before I came back 2 years ago. And what's amazing is just how fast Qatar transitions as a society. And when we think about water issues, and when we think about things like the population that's here and the development that's here, historically, the population level was kept to a certain cap, given largely on account of the water resources that were here. But of course, we're now at a population that goes well beyond what historically we could do in the area. And as Dean Masri mentioned earlier, when we go to the tap and we turn it on, there's water there. It's there. As Kieran in our last panel mentioned, we've transformed energy into water, and there's a sense in which it's abundant. And yet we've also heard, and we know, that 6 out of the 10 most water-stressed countries are here in the region, and there are large structural realities and challenges that Qatar as a nation faces. But it continues to move very fast. It's not sitting still on these issues at all, and in fact has the potential to both demonstrate and to advance what's happening in the region, as well as other regions around the world that are water stressed. So I'm very excited for the panel that we have here to welcome Dr. Jenny Lawler, who is a Senior Research Director at the Water Center for QEERI, which is Qatar's Environment and Energy Research Initiative. We have Dr. Dima Al-Masri, who comes to us from EarthNA. As we heard on the last panel, EarthNA plays a critical role in the transition between science and policy here in the country. And also we're very excited to welcome Mr. Mahmoud Al-Marwani, who is the Assistant Director of the Climate Change Department at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves, along with a prompt that I'm going to give. So I think we will start, and we'll go down the road this way. So Dr. Lawler, you first. And really what I want to hear is just from your perspective, as you introduce yourself, what are the major water security and sustainability challenges that you see facing Qatar today?
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm Senior Research Director of the Water Center at Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute. We're part of Hamad bin Khalifa University, a member of Qatar Foundation. I have been in Qatar for 4 years, and as you mentioned, Qatar has undergone vast transformations. Even in the short time that I've been here, I've seen evidence of this. Qatar is, as you mentioned, one of the most water-stressed countries in the world, but as has already been pointed out in the previous panel, we have abundant energy resources which enable us to meet that challenge. So rather than looking really at the challenges that the country faces, which are well known, there's a virtual complete lack of fresh water, which is met by the early technology adoption by Qatar and the other Gulf countries via desalination, but rather we can look at the opportunities that this challenge presents. So Qatar, along with the other Gulf countries, has invested significantly in infrastructure to meet these challenges, both in terms of being able to harness desalination as a sustainable technology to meet the goals of providing fresh water to the population, both for citizens, for industry, and to support the economy, but also in the area of the circularity in the water sector. So looking at other non-conventional water resources that can be harnessed. And as an early technology adopter, what this means is that the learnings that are taking place in Qatar can be then exported to support the needs of other countries. So while it was pointed out, desalination technology, for example, it's available off the shelf. But it is the early adoption of countries like Qatar that have enabled this development and the reduction in price and the increase in affordability and accessibility of these kind of technologies for other countries, for more developing countries. So I think these are one of the ways that an opportunity has arisen out of the challenges that Qatar has faced up to.
Thank you. I love that reframing that you're giving us from the challenge to the opportunity that comes with that challenge. Please, Dr. Al-Nasser.
Hello, thank you very much. So I'm a senior policy associate currently at EarthNow, and I actually made a switch from being a scientist at QEERI to moving towards policy because I felt like I had the background, and EarthNet itself is basically conducts policy research as well as advocacy, and by utilizing both, I felt like from my perspective, I can provide more of an impact to the nation as well as the region more. So about the major water security and sustainability challenges facing Qatar, I'd like to mention too, and these two topics we're currently looking at EarthNow, is groundwater and desalination. So I feel like those are two major challenges that we need to look into. Groundwater, as the panelists mentioned in the previous talk, is being depleted at an alarming rate. And we need to secure that because groundwater is the lifeline of a country. The second topic is desalination in terms of water security. So Qatar is a peninsula, and desalination plants lie on the coastal areas of the country. So if anything happens, God forbid, you have an accident or any unpredicted event, if the seawaters around the desalination plants get contaminated, some plants will have to shut down, so you do need an alternative solution. So having those in mind, and that's what Dr. Jenny just mentioned, is Qatar does have water resources, but we also need to diversify them in case of any emergencies and to secure the water and have a sustainable future.
Thank you. And finally, please, Mr. Al.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. في البداية أحب أشكركم على دعوتكم لي لحضور هذه الجلسة. طبعا لا يخفى عليكم أن أهم تحديات الأمن المائي في دولة قطر ندرة موارد المياه العذبة في قطر، ولذلك يعني المصدر الرئيسي يعتبر للمياه الطبيعية هو مياه البحر، وتقوم دولة قطر بتحلية مياه البحر لأنه يعتبر هو المصدر الرئيسي لمياه الشرب. مثل ما تعرفون أن عملية تحلية مياه البحر تتطلب طاقة عالية في التحلية، فالانبعاثات المتولدة عن ذلك تعتبر عالية. احنا في وزارة البيئة والتغير المناخي يعني من بين التحديات اللي نواجهها المحافظة على المياه الجوفية وتخفيف الانبعاثات الناتجة عن تحلية مياه البحر. طبعا كذلك لا يخفى عليكم أن التغير المناخي يسبب خلل في أنماط هطول الأمطار، وهي يأثر على المياه الجوفية عندنا. فإحنا كذلك يعني بصدد إعداد خطط للتكيف مع هذه الآثار والتخفيف من حدة التغيرات المناخية.
Thank you very much. And in fact, I think we'll continue here. Very much appreciate the perspective from the ministry that you're able to provide on that. And remind everybody in the audience, you've got the QR codes. We will take questions from the audience if there's any questions in particular, things that you want to hear about Qatar and its Odyssey here. But turning the first question to you, Mr. Al-Marwani, Qatar, like a lot of regions, it faces challenges that are posed by climate change, including, as we've already heard, altered precipitation levels and temperature rise in the region. And so how is the Ministry for Environment and Climate Change integrating adaptation strategies into Qatar's water policies? And if you could share maybe some specific examples or initiatives that demonstrate the synergy between climate change adaptation and supporting a sustainable water future for the nation.
طبعا في عام 2021 دشن معالي رئيس مجلس الوزراء استراتيجية قطر للبيئة والتغير المناخي. هذه الاستراتيجية تحتوي على 5 مجالات، كل مجال منها يحتوي على رؤية وأهداف مشتركة وعوامل تمكين تنفيذ هذه الأهداف. أحد هذه المجالات ال5 هو مجال المياه. الاستراتيجية أذكرت أن هناك أهمية لاعتماد مناهج متكاملة لإدارة المياه وخفض الاستهلاك الإجمالي وتقليل استهلاك الفرد من المياه. كذلك من الأولويات كذلك معالجة مياه الصرف الصحي وإعادة استخدامها. الاستراتيجية كذلك تهدف إلى تقليل الاعتماد على المياه الجوفية من خلال تشجيع استخدام المياه المعاد تدويرها. كذلك في نفس العام دشن معالي رئيس مجلس الوزراء أيضا خطة قطر الوطنية للتغير المناخي. في هذه الخطة تم وضع أكثر من 300 مبادرة للتكيف مع آثار التغير المناخي، تقريبا 14 مبادرة منها خاصة بالماء والأمن المائي. كذلك وزارة البيئة والتغير المناخي حاليا تقوم بإجراء دراسة مفصلة لتحليل الحاجة إلى خطط التكيف في البلاد. هدف هذه الدراسة تحديد المناطق الأكثر هشاشة في الدولة من حيث التغير المناخي والأكثر تعرضاً وتأثراً بالتغير المناخي وتقييم الآثار المستقبلية لها، على أساس نعرف إحنا يعني وين رايحين إذا استمر الوضع على ما هو عليه. عقب نتائج هذه الدراسة إن شاء الله بتقوم الوزارة بوضع خطط خاصة بالتكيف لضمان استعداد الدولة لمواجهة آثار التغير المناخي. فهذه الخطوة تعتبر ضمان لتدابير التكيف تتخذها الوزارة في الوقت الحالي.
Thank you very much. And to build a little bit on your points there, I think clearly in order to run those initiatives, we have to have good science. As you were saying, we have to know where we're going, how things are going. And Dr. Jenny, just to talk a little bit more about, you mentioned desalination earlier and the significant role that plays here in the region, that this was an area of early adoption for that technology. But with it, of course, comes significant environmental concerns as well. Right? Desalination isn't free in either the financial or the ecological sense. And so how is the Water Center working towards balancing the reliance on desalination with the development of other sustainable water sources, ideas of reduction and reuse, as Mr. Al-Marwani was just mentioning, whether it's wastewater or rainwater harvesting. We're all thinking about the massive storms that we've just had here and the amount of water that we had come down in a very short time. What are, again, the various efforts that you think we can take to ensure a diversified and environmentally responsible water supply for Qatar?
Okay, so first of all, let me say a little bit about the desalination landscape in Qatar. So Qatar historically relied on cogeneration of water and power. So what this means is that although it's often stated that there is a high energy requirement for desalination, that it's a very expensive process and requires so much energy, actually the water has been a byproduct of the electricity generation process. So the energy that was required to desalinate the water came as the heat from the electricity generation process in gas turbines. And that still very much makes up part of the fabric of the desalination in Qatar and in a lot of the other Gulf states today. So this is thermal desalination. So the other type of main type of desalination that we have in the region is reverse osmosis or membrane-based desalination. So this type of desalination has a lower energy requirement than thermal desalination, but it's typically provided by electricity. And this is very favorable for the region for a number of reasons, but one of them is the transition towards renewables. So Qatar has a strong commitment towards the integration of renewable energy into the electricity matrix here in Qatar, along with other renewable sources. This is really exemplified by the change of name of our national Qatar Energy last year from Qatar Petroleum to Qatar Energy, reflecting the potential diversification in the future and the plans for integration of renewables into the country. So at present, reverse osmosis makes up about 40% of the desalination in the country. As you said, it's not free. There is an energy requirement in it, but at present we have established now Al-Marwani, the first large-scale solar energy plant in Qatar in the last year. Still, we're at small scale. That represents about 1% of the electricity requirement for the country, but we're moving in the right direction. And I think that this is very important because it not only looks at reduction in the energy requirements for desalination, but also in the reduction of the environmental impact of the energy required. So in terms of if you look at carbon accounting, for example, that should be minimized. That requires innovation, okay? So one of the challenges that we face here in the region is actually, somebody mentioned earlier, the seawater is 35,000 parts per million. That's not the case for Qatar. It's actually quite a bit higher. So on the east coast of Qatar, we're looking at about 42,000 parts per million. On the west coast of Qatar, it's even higher. It can be up to 57,000 parts per million. So it's significantly more challenging to desalinate, particularly with membrane desalination, than what you see in other parts of the world where membrane desalination is really, really common, such as, for example, in the southeastern Mediterranean region, where you have that 35,000 parts per million. So that's one of the challenges that we're already facing. That requires innovation, it requires research and development. When we look at moving towards electricity-driven desalination, what we need to do is we need to improve the energy efficiency of these processes. And there's a huge amount of work being done globally to do that. One of the key issues with desalination, particularly when you look at this higher saltiness that we experience here, is the issue of scaling that we experience both in thermal and membrane desalination plants. What this means is that there has to be an addition of chemicals into the seawater feed for the desalination plant. So these chemicals are then put back out into the seawater as a reject. This is called the brine. So there's a lot of research that needs to take place to help minimize this environmental impact of this. This is really, really critical. And just before I move on to the environmental impact, what I want to say is something about the salinity. So there have been concerns previously. We have all of these different countries along the Gulf that are desalinating, as was mentioned previously. So we have a huge number of desalination plants, and the amount of desalination that will take place in this region is expected to increase massively over the coming years due to the less fresh water available in the region, due to increasing population, due to the projected changes that we'll face due to climate change. So one of the interesting things that has come out recently, a study out of the UAE, has been what is going to happen to the Gulf if we have all these desalination plants? The temperature is going to rise due to climate change. We're going to have increased amounts of brine going back out into the Gulf. And what's going to happen? Is the Gulf going to get so salty that we can't desalinate anymore? Is this really sustainable? And this very interesting study that came out has been quite comprehensive. It's looked at the worst projections for climate change, the 8.5, which looks at a 5-degree warming in the Gulf towards the end of the century. And what it's seen when it looked at comparing the natural evaporation rates, which is the natural desalination process whereby fresh water is removed out of the sea and it then falls as precipitation elsewhere, the desalination from the desalination plants is only expected to be about 10 to 20% of that natural evaporation rate. So it's not insignificant, but the projections that the study looks at, which has been very comprehensive, is what happens to the turnover of brine. Can it be sustainable for the region, or will we face an issue where we simply can't desalinate the sea anymore? And the answer to that question is no, we do not face that issue. the rise in temperature is going to be far more detrimental than actually the brine discharge to the sea. So desalination is essentially sustainable for the region. It can continue without really being very, very problematic into the future. So that's the first question. So then we look at the environmental impacts. So yes, the brine is discharged back to the sea. At least 50% of the water that is desalinated goes back into the sea as a concentrated brine. It's high in salinity, it's high in these chemicals that are added, particularly anti-scaling chemicals that are added to make the process feasible. And this is a problem. So one of the really nice things about Qatar and Qatar's approach to the integration between research and development and the strategy for the country moving forward is that there is a very robust dialogue between, for example, the Ministry of Environment and the research performing institutions around the country. We've had the opportunity to be able to inform the national development strategies, and Qatar has been very forward thinking in terms of its environmental strategies. For example, the national strategy on climate change, the national strategy on biodiversity, and there's been a lot of cross-linking and collaboration in the country on these kind of topics. So, for example, we know that Qatar and the surrounding regions have some of the most amazing marine biodiversity, and this is integrated into the strategy for climate change, the strategy for water for the country. And under the new national development strategy, we know that we have to take real action, and this is mandated for by the country in terms of things like reduction of the brine that is going into the ocean. We are looking at the potential for reduction in that brine discharge quite significantly into the future. We're also looking at the reduction in abstraction of groundwater, which Dr. Dima mentioned previously, because this is something that is simply unsustainable for the country going forward. So Qatar has really put a lot of effort into that, and in terms of developing regulations and policy that will support the continued provision of fresh water via sustainable desalination technologies and the protection of the environment going forward.
Yeah, thank you, and I really appreciate that the holism that you're bringing to bear here. We can talk about desalination, we can talk about how that fits ecologically, but of course it fits in with all of these other issues that are key issues and that we're going to be hearing a lot more about here during this conference. Dr. Dima, EarthNA is serving a very unique role, again, as we talked about, this broker between science and policy. And in terms of connecting science with policy decisions, of course, it's very challenging, but key to implementing scientifically robust and sustainable water management interventions. And if you could speak to some of the key initiatives at EarthNA and how you're approaching this transition. In particular, you mentioned groundwater and the depletion of groundwater, and especially for anybody in the audience who isn't familiar with, well, do we just wait for it to rain and replenish, right? If you could speak a little bit to the kinds of policies that can be effective to helping us to maintain a supply of fresh groundwater.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so to answer your question, so last week, EarthNA held a water workshop, and we invited key local stakeholders such as Kahramaa, Ashghar, the ministry, QEERI, Georgetown University representatives, as well as representatives from other universities. And the major part that our role at EarthNA is to bring people together, because we cannot come up with policies without engaging the local community. You can come up with a brilliant idea, and me with a background as a scientist, if I come up with a brilliant, amazing technology or idea, and you can go on working on it for a while, but after you engage with local stakeholders, they can just tell you it's a terrible idea for this country, or we've already done it and it didn't work. So that's one of the most important things of engaging with local stakeholders. And we held the workshop, and it was actually a wonderful experience. Many people, it's always great to have all these people in one room talking about the urgent matters of water security. So going back to, and one of the topics that we spoke about in this workshop is groundwater. And so basically, and it's very important, because groundwater, we don't see groundwater. And it's always like out of sight, out of mind. You don't know what's happening, but it's a very important issue that we need to face, because if Qatar doesn't have a source of fresh water as an alternative to others, it could be in a very, let's say, not very secure position. So we need to preserve it, and that's what the country is working on. If we continue business as usual, the groundwater wells will probably be depleted by 2033. That's like 10 years from now. And this is a very, very important matter that we need to address urgently, because currently the groundwater is being abstracted at a rate of almost 5 times the rate of replenishment. The only source of replenishment right now is through rainfall, which with climate change is it's either less than before, it's unpredictable. So that's one thing that we need to look into, the current situation as it is. As I mentioned before, most of the groundwater wells are right now currently brackish or highly saline. So you can't really, the farmers are using them, they're adding our reverse osmosis systems to treat them to irrigate their crops. So the brackish water in the current wells that they have access to is actually not even good enough. So what happened? Why is groundwater being abstracted that much? Why did the situation come to this point? And that's because there's this mindset of groundwater is kind of, it's a free resource. So everyone has the right to dig a well. That was in the past, and that's what happened. So a lot of the farming industry, they are pressured to produce agriculture, and the major source of water is groundwater. So they dug wells and they abstracted, they kept on pumping out, to the point where most of the groundwater wells, and it's not only for agricultural crops, it's also for fodder. So almost 70% of the groundwater wells or groundwater is used for fodder production. And so the groundwater itself is not only being depleted, but the quality is decreasing as well. And you also have seawater intrusion because some wells were dug near the sea itself. So this is a whole issue, but it's not as terrible as I'm making it sound. The country is moving towards solutions. So the country has realized that the wells need to be monitored. So with the Qatar water strategies, new policies have been come out that wells should not be dug without licenses from the country. So basically, thou shall not dig a well. You cannot dig a well before getting permission from the country. Farmers are not, there are limitations towards expanding their farms. And so that allowed, actually, if you think of it in a way, they did restrict, so the country did cause some restrictions to protect the groundwater resource. But some of the farmers actually became more creative. So there is a limitation. You cannot dig more wells. And the farmers, some of them, they add reverse osmosis to the wells, but they notice that the wells themselves that they have is not sufficient. The water level is going down. So what they did was they became wet creative, and Agrico farm is a very good example of this. They started adding hydroponics, aquaponics system inside of the farm itself, which reduces the amount of water. So basically it recycles the water. And for example, aquaponics uses fertilizers. It's basically nutrients you get from the fish, and you don't need an external fertilizer for that. So there's that, there are these things. So sometimes the country puts limitations, sometimes that allows for creativity, and that's one aspect of it. So basically it's that not allowing to dig more wells, monitoring the wells. That is also the country has new policies in the future that they will, and they already started on these. There are initiatives of putting monitors in the wells and metering and seeing how much farmers are taking out. And so in a few years, there will be a policy, or there will be a strategy of not using groundwater for fodder. So using treated sewage effluent for fodder. And so you may think of you may ask why the country did not stop the farmers from using groundwater. You can't just put in a policy without giving them an alternative. So that's one of the things the country is trying to find alternatives to give the farmers to actually conserve these groundwater wells. I can go on groundwater. So
no, this is fabulous. And again, you're bringing up some of these key holistic connections. And here in between water security, as we're discussing here, and of course food security, which is also something else that we'll hear more about later. And likewise, the importance, as was brought up in the last panel, we have desalination, but likewise the reuse of water is a critical element here when we start talking about sustainability, as well as the reduction of what's being used. So fortunately, one of the fortuitous things that's happening is a lot of the questions that we're getting in are exactly the sorts of things that our panelists are talking about. But one here that I'm gonna read out is what public data is available on water scarcity and water use. And Mr. Al-Marwani, I think I'll turn to you. to maybe talk a little bit about this, and also what are the important sources of data that the ministry takes into account as it thinks about how to create and implement climate and water policy?
طبعا بالنسبة للبيانات المائية يمكن الجهة اللي يعني معنية بهذا الموضوع أكثر هي كهرماء، هي اللي عندها أكثر البيانات الخاصة باستخدامات المياه في الدولة. لكن وزارة البيئة والتغير المناخي دشنت منصة بيئتنا المستدامة. هذه المنصة تقدم التوجيه والتوصيات حق القطاعات المختلفة في الدولة على أساس تساعدها في تبني استراتيجيات مستدامة أكثر، وركزت المنصة بشكل خاص على المياه باعتبارها من أهم الأولويات في الدولة اللي يجب مراعاتها. لكن أنا بتكلم عن إذا تسمح لي بخصوص الإجراءات اللي الوزارة يعني اتخذتها على أساس يعني تحرص على توفر المياه. أكيد التغير المناخي يأثر بشكل كبير في توفر المياه، يأثر في الدورة الطبيعية للمياه. التغير المناخي يمكن تسبب في تغير أنماط هطول الأمطار. يمكن الكل يلاحظ أن مواسم الأمطار عندنا هني تغير، بدأت في التغير، وحتى نسب الهطول مختلفة من فترة لفترة، يعني بكميات ما كنا معتادين عليها في السابق. قطر من أوائل الدول اللي وقعت على اتفاق باريس، ويعني وملتزمة باتفاق باريس لأقصى حد. قدمت دولة قطر تقرير المساهمات المحددة وطنيا المحدث في عام 2021. ذكر هذا التقرير أن قطر إن شاء الله راح تقوم بتخفيض انبعاثاتها بنسبة 25% من سنة أساس 2019. في 2019 بلغت كمية الانبعاثات تقريبا حوالي شوي أقل من 110 مليون طن من مكافئ ثاني أكسيد الكربون. إذا ظلينا على سيناريو العمل المعتاد في الوضع الحالي، الانبعاثات من المتوقع أن تصل في عام 2030 إلى حوالي 146 مليون طن من مكافئ ثاني أكسيد الكربون، بدون تدخل دون تدخل من الدولة أو إجراءات. ذلك يمكن يرجع بسبب زيادة الطلب على الغاز الطبيعي، وقطر مثل ما أنتم عارفين من يمكن أكبر دولة مصدرة للغاز الطبيعي في العالم. كذلك بسبب النمو السكاني المتزايد في قطر بشكل كبير. خطة العمل الوطنية تهدف إلى تخفيض الانبعاثات بحوالي 37 مليون طن، من 146 إن شاء الله راح نخفض 37 مليون طن عن طريق إجراءات راح نتخذها. حوالي 36 إجراء خاص بالتخفيف، وأكثر مثل ما قلت قبل أكثر من 300 إجراء خاص بالتكيف. القطاعات اللي نستهدفها في التخفيف قطاع النفط والغاز. يمكن من أكبر المشاريع الموجودة مشروع تخزين وحجز التقاط غاز ثاني، التقاط الكربون، حجز الكربون تخزينه. في قطاع المواصلات وصل تقريبا إلى يعني كهربة إذا صح التعبير الحافلات إلى حوالي 70% من حافلات النقل العام الآن تعمل بالطاقة الكهربائية. بكذلك مشروع مترو الدوحة وترام لوسيل، كلها مشاريع تساهم في التخفيف. في قطاع البناء والتخطيط والصناعة، مثل ما أنتم عارفين يعني في توجه للدولة أن بزيادة يعني بإنشاء المدن المستقبلية تكون عبارة عن مدن مستدامة ومدن ذكية. وطبعا يعني مثل ما قلت لك الوزارة دشنت منصة بيئتنا المستدامة، وممكن ترجعون لها، وأي يعني بتفيد القطاعات المختلفة في الدولة في الإرشادات اللازمة.
So, absolutely, I really appreciate this and this point that you're bringing directly with regard to climate change, with regard to emissions. As we've mentioned, currently, our efforts to have water security rely on emissions, and yet Qatar has made global agreements. It's committed to keeping those global agreements, and so I very much appreciate that discussion. I'm gonna stick here a little bit on this, and in terms of addressing water security and sustainability, it often requires global collaboration and the exchange of knowledge and best practices with others. So could you elaborate on Qatar's efforts to collaborate with international organizations and other countries in the field of water management as well as climate change adaptation?
بالتأكيد يعني موضوع التغير المناخي يتطلب تعاون دولي. يعني في مجال التغير المناخي صعب دولة تعمل بروحها، لأن تأثيراتها يعني تكون على أكثر من دولة. يعني يمكن دول ما شاركت في الثورة الصناعية اللي حدثت في القرن قبل الماضي، لكن تعتبر هي من أكثر الدول تأثراً بالتغير المناخي. احنا في قطر ندرك ان التكيف مع آثار التغير المناخي موضوع مهم، ولذلك يعني في عام تعتبر دولة قطر من الدول المؤسسة للمعهد العالمي للنمو الأخضر اللي مقره في كوريا. وفي عام 2021 وقعنا مذكرة تفاهم مع المعهد لأنه يفتح له مكتب في الدوحة، والمكتب الحين يعني شغال، وشغالين معهم في عدة مشاريع، أهمها مشروع تقييم الآثار السلبية للتغير المناخي. عندنا كذلك ورك ستريم خاص بالتنمية ببناء القدرات في مجال التعاون الدولي. في ورك ستريم شغالين فيه خاص بإعداد نظام خاص بالرصد والإبلاغ والتحقق، هدفه يعني جمع أكبر يعني ما يمكن من قاعدة بيانات خاصة بالانبعاثات في الدولة. كذلك الحين حاليا احنا شغالين مع معهد ميتسوبيشي للأبحاث في مشروع خاص بتقييم أو وإيجاد فرص لتداول الكربون يعني في قطر في المرحلة الأولى. في المرحلة الثانية نهدف إلى أن شوي نطلع برا. يعني يمكن هذه أبرز المجالات يعني في التعاون مع المعاهد.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Marwani. And taking a look here at another question, we've got several, Dr. Jenny, you inspired a number of questions regarding the brine and sort of what we do with that. And so if you could talk about, is it necessary to release it back into the ocean? What are the various forms of treatment that you mentioned that we can do? Are there innovative ways that people are looking at using that brine rather than merely releasing it?
Yeah, so you're correct. There's a huge amount of potential in brine. So the limitation at the moment for the standard desalination technologies is that they can achieve what's called a recovery ratio of about 50%. So they can recover about 50% of fresh water from the seawater, and the rest has to be discharged as brine. And that's really the kind of limitation at present of the off-the-shelf technologies. So there's now a growing body of research which has led to commercialization of these more emerging technologies in terms of squeezing the brine, what's called brine squeezing, trying to recover up to 80–90% of the water. The issue is that requires more and more energy. So if you want to not send any brine back to the sea and recover all of the water from it, what you end up with is a highly energy intensive process going the whole way towards, for example, crystallization. So it requires energy for evaporation, for example. An alternative is to put the brine to the land, but this is obviously very environmentally damaging. You'll have large sand or salt flats where you have natural evaporation. So that doesn't require any energy, but it's not very good environmentally. So the international community is looking more and more towards new technologies to try and recover more water from the brine, more salt from the brine, and then other valuable elements. So for example, some of the potentially feasible metals and salts that can be recovered from that brine might include lithium, that might include boron for this region. We have quite high boron levels. But the kind of way to do that, it has to be driven by regulatory drivers. So at present, there is not a regulatory driver to put the investment into infrastructure and development and technology implementation to try to recover more and more from that brine. But that is something that the international research community is looking at very carefully. And I know you mentioned, international collaboration is key, and I think academia and research institutes are, this is something that has always been a facet of research in academia. It's been collaborating internationally. So for example, we look to other research institutes around the world and trying to benchmark what's the best practice, where can we go in terms of technology and implementation and development. For example, we're in the process of signing an agreement with the Saudi Saline Water Conversion Corporation. We have an agreement with Kuwait Institute for Science and Technology. Later on this week, QEERI have a joint webinar with the Institute of Technology in Monterrey in Mexico, because so many of these arid regions are coming up with the same kind of issues, and brine is one of them. It's a really, really critical issue worldwide, and it's something that will be solved by co-development of technologies and implementation going forward. But as I said, it is something that's very much to the forefront now for Qatar and potentially minimizing the brine discharge. So we're looking at learning from industry, for example. So obviously Qatar, as has been mentioned, we're an oil and gas country, and there are specific issues in terms of water management that are specific to industry. And industry in this country have gone the whole way to zero liquid discharge. So they've treated the water, the salty water, to such an extent that they're not discharging anything into the ocean. They're recovering everything. Yes, it is energy intensive, but there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from that can then be expanded to the municipal sector. So we look at technologies like electrodialysis. We look at technologies like hybrid thermal membrane technologies that can look at squeezing more and more from these brine streams. So that's definitely the focus going forward. But it's a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And with both of these last two comments that we've had, we see that Qatar's journey is very much tied up with the journey of partners in the region, whether we're talking about private or governmental, and that the sharing, the two-way sharing that happens is really critical. Dr. Dima, talking again about farming and the importance of water for agriculture and such, we have a question. Is there any water collection cisterns or reservoirs to ways of creating that to be used later? And I think about this, where I grew up in the western part of the United States, of course, rainwater capture, particularly for agriculture, is an important element. So we'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that here in Qatar.
Yeah, I'm glad that person asked that question, because I wanted to bring that up. So that was the opportunity. Qatar is actually very active, or has a lot of initiatives in terms of recharging the aquifers. So there's a realization that the groundwater wells should not be left as is. Initially they wanted to, but then there have been several initiatives in Qatar by Ashghal, by Kahramaa, in terms of, number one, surface groundwater, taking that from the surface in the urban areas. So there's surface groundwater in the urban areas, where sometimes when there's infrastructure, where there's drilling, sometimes water would come up in the urban areas, and that was something that they would try to extract and preserve for later. There's also treated sewage effluent that they plan on reusing. So basically using those to inject in the wells. So treated sewage effluent, or TSE, is one non-conventional water resource that they're planning on using. There are seasonal variations in this. It is high in demand in the summer, and thus there's this low in supply, and then in the winter time, it is high in supply. So they take the excess of TSE, and there's an initiative of injecting them into the wells. And in that sense, there would be in the wells, there would be this buffer zone that would happen. And basically, it's kind of indirect potable reuse, where you leave it there for a while and then reuse it later on for farming. There's also the rainwater harvesting. We all witnessed the floods several weeks ago. The residents of Qatar. I myself was stuck in the flood, and the whole time, the water levels were almost waist deep. And the whole time I was looking, I'm like, what a waste of water. We could use this. But the country's also building infrastructure in terms of harvesting this water. This needs a lot of time and investment. In order to do something very well, you need to give it time. It has to be done perfectly well in order for it to be to withstand the climate change and change in weather in the future. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think, so we're coming to the end of our time here, and maybe if we could briefly just hear from each of you a final note on, in your research, in your work, in your efforts, what are you most excited about with regard to Qatar and the direction that it's going when it comes to issues of water and issues of climate? And we'll start with you, Dr. Jenny. We'll move down and we'll hear our last word from Mr. Al-Marwani.
Sure, yeah. So for me, I've spoken a lot about desalination on the panel. That's just kind of the way it came out. But my deepest interest for water security here is the circular economy for the water sector. It's looking at alternatives. We need to reduce the footprint of desalination for the country. We need to look at harnessing other water resources for the country. And there is massive opportunity. So we've spoken a lot about treated sewage effluent, we've spoken about surface groundwater, but there are a lot more water resources, and there's a lot of focus being put on that in Qatar going forward. So that's things like responsible urban planning for smart water management. It's looking at opportunities in things like hyper-local urban water management, localized wastewater treatment, for example, segregation of grey water in residential complexes with localized treatment and reuse. It's looking at the concept of water to air, for example, so looking at capturing humidity from air. This is great international interest, but this is something Qatar is doing on a huge scale already in our building air handling units. So every large building that has air conditioning is actually capturing water from the air in the condensation that the air handling units take. So we have opportunities in terms of taking those water resources and treating them to the intended end use. It doesn't have to be for potable or for drinking water standard, and being able to use them locally. So, and it's a multifaceted research opportunity. We have to look at the social and behavioral aspects. We have to look at the demand side management, reducing the demand, looking at more energy and water efficient appliances and uses, and what we can do from the very small level all the way up to the highest level in terms of establishing policies and regulations that drive water reuse and water circularity in the country. And I think Qatar is really at the forefront of that. And it has been driven that way, as was pointed out by Malcolm earlier. It's an urgent necessity, and Qatar has proven that it is exceptionally good at that. When we looked at the blockade in 2017 and what Qatar did to respond to that, it was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. The country turned itself around overnight to meet that challenge. So it's a very exciting place to be. And I think there's huge scope for innovation. And that's what I'm really excited about in this country going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll keep mine very brief, but just to start off with, last week we had the Deputy Director of UNU-INWA, which is the United Nations Water think tank, come visit us at Earth Now. And he attended some talks, he gave a presentation, and we discussed our work with him and Qatar's situation. And he was very fascinated. First of all, he's fascinated by, he knew of the situation, the challenges in arid regions, but Qatar has the resources. It does, and it's always interesting to see, like, there's a challenge, but there are so many people working on it. And that's basically what I'm excited about, is working with the other entities, such as the ministry, the research institutes and universities as well, And us in Earth Now, that's what we do. We kind of look at what everyone is doing and try to play our part in terms of implementing policy recommendations and then providing them back to the ministries and government.
Thank you.
طبعا بالإضافة إلى ما ذكروه الزملاء يمكن أنا كنت حاضر في كاب 18 اللي استضافتها الدوحة في عام 2012. يمكن كثير منكم موجودين. سعادة الدكتور محمد السادة كان موجود. يمكن يذكر احنا كان عندنا تحدي في يعني تشجيع الشباب على الانخراط في مواضيع التغير المناخي هني في قطر يعني على وجه الخصوص ويمكن في المنطقة بشكل عام. عقب حوالي 11 سنة الحين إذا أقارن وين كنا وين صرنا يعني قطعنا شوط كبير الحمد لله. المؤسسات البحثية، الشباب، طلاب الجامعات اللي يعني صار عندهم اهتمام بموضوع التغير المناخي عدد كبير وهاي شيء إيجابي صراحة. لكن أنا ودي إن أيضا إن مراكز البحث الشباب ما يعني مثل ما يركزون على أسباب حدوث تغير المناخ وهاي يركزون أيضا على تأثيراته على بالذات على المنطقة، على الشعوب، على الاقتصاد، على المياه، إيش تأثيراته وإيش أبعاد الموضوع التاريخية. يعني موضوع التغير المناخي ما ينفع أن أنت تطالعه من اليوم فقط. يعني الموضوع نتاج يعني عمل سنين سواء يعني الإيجابي منها والسلبي. فمهم البحث يعني في الأبعاد التاريخية وكذلك في الوضع الحالي للمجتمعات شلون تقدر تتعاطى مع موضوع التغير المناخي. أشكركم عليه.
Well, my thanks to all of our panelists. We will break now for lunch for an hour.